The brass bell above the door of Murphy's Diner hadn't been polished in 15 years, but it still rang true every morning at exactly 5:15 when Frank Sullivan pushed through the heavy glass door to start his shift. Pittsburgh winter mornings had a particular bite to them, the kind that worked its way through 3 layers of clothing and settled deep in your bones. But Frank had learned to appreciate the cold. It kept him sharp,
Give me the
kept him
money!
moving,
All of it!
kept him
Move
from
now!
thinking too much about what his life had become. The diner sat on Carson
Please,
Street in the
don't
South
hurt us.
Side,
Well,
squeezed
this
between a
section right
laundromat that
here.
had been closed for 6 months
Watch the wind. Keep
and
your
a
feet
check-cashing
clean.
place that did steady business every Friday. The neon sign flickered between Murphy's and M. Arfishai's depending on the weather, and the vinyl seats had been patched so many times they looked like a road map of 30 years of breakfast service. The floor tiles, once white with black diamonds, had aged into a uniform gray that no amount of mopping could brighten. Frank tied his apron behind his back with practiced efficiency, the same double knot he'd learned in the shipyard 25 years ago, back when his hands built things that floated on water instead of carrying plates that barely floated above minimum wage. The coffee was already brewing 3 pots of regular and one of decaf that hardly anyone ever ordered, but Joe insisted on having ready. Joe Murphy always started the coffee at 5 sharp before heading to the back office to wrestle with invoices and supply orders that seemed to multiply overnight like bacteria in a petri dish. The kitchen was already alive with the sounds and smells of morning prep. Marcus, the night cook who stayed late to help with the morning rush, was laying out strips of bacon on the flat top, the sizzle and pop, creating a rhythm that Frank could work to. The smell of bacon grease mixed with coffee and the faint scent of industrial cleaner that never quite left the place, creating an atmosphere that Frank had grown to associate with survival, with getting through another day. "Morning, Frank," Betty called from behind the counter, where she was filling salt shakers with the precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Betty Kowalski had been working the morning shift for 12 years, knew every regular by name and coffee preference, and had the unique ability to carry on 3 different conversations while taking 4 orders and never missing a beat. She was built solid, the kind of woman who could carry a full tray in each hand and still manage to dodge the grabby hands of the occasional drunk who wandered in after the bars closed. "Morning, Betty. Cold one out there. When isn't it?" She glanced at the clock mounted above the pie case, its face yellowed with age and grease. "20 minutes until the early birds. You want to get table 12? Someone spilled syrup yesterday afternoon, and the night shift did their usual stellar job of ignoring it." The night shift was 2 kids from the community college who spent more time on their phones than cleaning. Frank didn't blame them entirely. At 19, he wouldn't have cared much about properly cleaning a diner either. But at 48, with nowhere else to go, maintaining some standards felt like the only control he had left. Frank grabbed a rag and the spray bottle of industrial cleaner that could probably strip paint if you left it on long enough. Table 12 was a 4-top by the window, one of the better spots in the place when the sun came up. The booth seats were original real leather that had cracked and been repaired so many times it looked like tree bark. As he scrubbed at the crystallized maple syrup, working the rag into the cracks of the worn Formica tabletop, he caught sight of his reflection in the dark window. 48 years old hair, more gray than brown, now lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His shoulders were still broad from his welding days, but they hunched forward now, curved by the weight of carrying trays and the larger burden of disappointment. He looked like his father had at 60, worn down by work that was honest but unforgiving. Thomas Sullivan had died at 62, his lungs full of foundry dust, still talking about the good old days when Pittsburgh Steel built America. Frank had sworn he'd be different, and for a while he had been. 20 years at Cary Furnace, good union job benefits that actually meant something. He'd been somebody, then Frank Sullivan, welder first class, the guy you called when you needed a perfect bead on a critical joint. He could run vertical overhead passes that looked like stacks of dimes, could read blueprints. Like some people read novels, understood metal, the way a musician understands rhythm. Then the furnace closed. They said it was global competition, Chinese steel dumping, environmental regulations, changing times. Whatever the reason, 300 men lost their jobs on a Tuesday afternoon, got their last checks and a pat on the back for decades of service. Some found other work. Some drank themselves to death. Frank found Murphy's Diner and a new routine that paid just enough to keep the lights on and not enough to dream about anything bigger. The morning crowd at Murphy's was as predictable as sunrise. First came the hospital workers ending their night shifts at UPMC, desperate for coffee that could wake the dead and something that would stay in their stomachs during the drive home. They ordered eggs over easy and wheat toast tipped decent because they understood what it meant to be on your feet all night. Then came the construction crews loud and hungry, their boots leaving muddy tracks that Frank would mop up between rushes. They ordered enough eggs and bacon to feed a small army, complained about the coffee being too weak, and tipped in crumpled dollar bills, pulled from pockets full of wood screws and measuring tape. By 6:30, you'd get the office workers grabbing coffee and bagels to go, always in a hurry, always checking their phones, treating Frank like he was part of the furniture. They'd hand him credit cards without looking up from their screens, grab their orders without saying, "Thank you," leave exact change like they were doing him a favor by being precise. But Walter Brennan didn't fit any category. The man was 82 years old, a Korean War veteran who'd built a steel empire and then watched it dissolve into overseas operations and quarterly reports. He arrived every morning at 6:45, not 6:44 or 6:46, but 6:45, like he was punching a time clock that only he could see. Frank had been serving him for almost 2 years now, ever since that first gray February morning, when the old man had shuffled in, looked around the diner, like he was seeing it for the first time, despite probably passing it 1,000 times, and chosen the corner booth by the window. That first morning Walter showed up, Frank hadn't thought much about him. Just another old-timer, probably lonely, looking for a warm place to read his paper. Pittsburgh was full of them, men who'd outlived their wives, their friends, their purpose now, marking time in diners and VFW halls, telling stories nobody wanted to hear anymore. Walter wore the same outfit every day, with minor variations: gray wool trousers that had been quality 40 years ago, a cardigan sweater over a white shirt that was always pressed but starting to yellow at the collar, and a navy peacoat that had seen better decades. His face had the kind of deep lines that came from squinting into furnace fires or across sun-bright water, and his hands shook just enough to make holding a coffee cup a two-handed operation. Frank had noticed the shaking on the third morning. Walter had been trying to cut his over easy eggs, the knife skittering across the plate, like it was trying to escape the fork, unable to pin anything down long enough to make a clean cut. The eggs broke apart, messily yellow yolk running everywhere, mixing with the hash browns in a way that clearly frustrated the old man. It was a small indignity, the kind that probably happened a dozen times a day for him, but Frank recognized the flash of frustration that crossed Walter's face before settling back into resigned acceptance. Frank knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror after Mary died, when he was trying to help Danny with his mother's role, making school lunches with hands that knew how to weld steel, but not how to cut crusts off sandwiches the way Mary had done. He'd seen it when Danny needed help with calculus homework that might as well have been written in ancient Greek, his thick welder's fingers fumbling with a calculator, while his son sat patient and understanding, pretending not to notice his father was drowning in equations he'd never learned. The next morning, Frank had taken Walter's plate back to the kitchen pass and quickly cut everything into bite-sized pieces before bringing it out. He used the same knife skills he'd learned from his mother, who could break down a whole chicken in under 2 minutes, making each cut precise and clean. He didn't say anything about it, just set the plate down with the same neutral efficiency he'd perfected over 3 years of carrying other people's food. The eggs were in neat squares, the bacon in strips just wide enough to pick up with a fork, the toast in triangles that wouldn't require sawing. Walter had looked at the plate, then up at Frank, and something passed between them. Not gratitude exactly, more like recognition. One man seeing another man clearly without pity or condescension. The same way the old hands at the furnace had looked at Frank when he'd first started recognizing someone who understood that dignity wasn't about what you did, but how you did it. After that, it became part of their routine. Walter would order his usual 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, 3 strips of bacon coffee black, and Frank would bring it out pre-cut into manageable pieces. The tip went from $1 to $2, slipped under the saucer like a secret between conspirators. Neither man acknowledged the arrangement verbally, but it was as solid as any contract. It took 3 weeks before Walter spoke beyond his order. Frank had just refilled his coffee, the stream of black liquid steaming in the cold morning air that leaked through the window sills, when Walter said, "You know anything about steel?" The question caught Frank off guard. He'd been thinking about Danny's tuition bill, calculating if he could pick up extra shifts to cover the interest on his credit cards. A bit. Worked the Cary furnace site before it closed, mostly welding work on the blast furnace repairs. Walter's eyes sharpened, losing that unfocused quality they usually carried. It was like watching a dimmed light bulb suddenly receive full power. Cary furnace. That was real work. What kind of rod you run? 7018, mostly for structural. Some dual shield flux core when we were working outside in the wind. Occasional TIG work on the stainless components, though. That was usually specialist work. You know your stuff. Walter took a careful sip of coffee, his hands steadier when they had something warm to hold. Most people think welding is just melting metal together. They don't understand it's about understanding expansion rates, penetration depth heat zones. It's chemistry and physics with your hands. Frank found himself leaning against the booth opposite Walter, something he never did with customers. Joe had rules about fraternizing, but the diner was nearly empty, and Betty was busy refilling ketchup bottles. You sound like you know the trade. Brennan Steele ran it for 40 years before selling to Arcelor. Walter's voice carried a mixture of pride and loss, like a man talking about a child who'd grown up and moved away. We supplied half the beam steel for bridges from here to Cleveland. Every major construction project in western Pennsylvania from 1960 to 2000 used our steel. You probably welded plenty of it. Frank thought about all the beams he'd worked on the stamps that identified their origin. BS had been common Brennan steel, though he'd never thought much about where it came from beyond the supply yard. Good steel. Never had inclusions, always consistent carbon content. That's because we never cut corners. Could have saved millions buying cheaper ore, could have reduced our quality controls, could have done what everyone else did and moved production to China. But I believed American steel should be made by American hands to American standards. Walter's jaw tightened. The company that bought us out didn't share that philosophy. They kept the name for 2 years, then shuttered the plants and moved everything overseas. That became their pattern. Every morning, Walter would eat his carefully cut breakfast, and they'd talk steel construction, the old Pittsburgh, before the tech companies moved in, and coffee shops started charging $6 for something that should cost 50 cents. Frank learned that Walter had fought in Korea, came back with shrapnel in his hip that still set off metal detectors, built his father's small fabrication shop into a major supplier through 16-hour days, and an understanding of metallurgy that bordered on intuitive. Walter had married a girl named Ruth from Squirrel Hill, had 2 children, lost his son in a car accident in 1991, watched his daughter Patricia grow distant after marrying a lawyer who thought manual labor was something you hired Mexicans to do. His grandson Eric had 3 degrees and no calluses, worked in something called digital marketing that seemed to involve tricking people into clicking on advertisements. The boys never created anything real. Walter said one morning, his eggs growing cold as he talked. Never felt the satisfaction of looking at something and saying, I built that. His idea of accomplishment is increasing click-through rates by 2%. Frank understood. Danny was different, thank God, studying mechanical engineering, but still interested in how things actually worked, not just the theory. But Frank worried sometimes that his son would graduate into a world that no longer valued the knowledge Frank had spent decades accumulating. One morning in October, about 6 months after they'd started really talking, Walter seemed different. His hands shook more than usual, and there was a gray tinge to his skin that Frank recognized from Mary's last months. The cancer had taken her piece by piece, first her energy, then her appetite, finally her ability to recognize him at the end. But Walter's eyes were bright, almost fevered, like a man with urgent business to complete. Frank, he said as soon as his breakfast arrived, not even waiting for Frank to cut it up. You have a boy, right? You mentioned him. Danny, he's 22, finishing up at Penn State. Mechanical engineering. Smart kid. You must be proud. I am. Loans are killing me, but he's worth it. First Sullivan to get a college degree. Frank didn't mention that paying for college meant he'd been living on ramen and peanut butter sandwiches for the past year, that he'd sold Mary's jewelry, except for her wedding ring, that he was 1 car repair away from bankruptcy. Walter nodded slowly, his trembling hand reaching for his coffee cup. My grandson Eric has 3 degrees. MBA from Wharton, something in computer science, another in God knows what. Never held a tool in his life, couldn't change a tire if his life depended on it. All that education, and he doesn't know how to build anything, just how to move money around on screens. There was a bitterness in Walter's voice that Frank hadn't heard before, deeper than simple disappointment. It was the sound of a man watching his legacy dissolve into nothing. Different kind of work these days, Frank offered, trying to be diplomatic. No, Walter said firmly, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. It's not work at all. Work is when you create something, fix something, make something better with your hands and your knowledge. Work leaves a mark on the world. What Eric does is just elaborate gambling with other people's money. Frank didn't know what to say to that, so he just refilled Walter's coffee and let the old man eat his breakfast in peace. But he thought about it for the rest of his shift, about what constituted real work, about the difference between creating value and extracting it. The following Sunday was unusual because Danny came to visit. He'd driven down from State College for the weekend, partly to see Frank, but mostly to interview for an internship at U.S. Steel's research facility in Monroeville. Frank was working the Sunday morning shift covering for Betty's grandson's baptism, and Danny decided to come by the diner for breakfast. "This is the famous Murphy's," Danny said, sliding into a booth near the service station where Frank was filling coffee pots. The boy looked good, healthy, and confident in a way Frank had never been at that age. He wore a Penn State engineering sweatshirt and jeans that didn't have holes from work, but from fashion. Smaller than I pictured. "Size isn't everything, college boy," Frank said, but he was smiling. Danny had his mother's features, sharp and intelligent, the kind of face that suggested quick thinking and careful planning. But he had Frank's hands, big and capable, with the Sullivan thumbs that were made for gripping tools. "When do you get a break? I want to hear about this interview tomorrow." 15 minutes. Order something, help keep my boss happy." Frank went back to his tables, refilling coffee for a table of nurses who'd just finished a 12-hour shift, taking an order from a young couple who'd clearly been up all night for different reasons than work. When he turned around 5 minutes later, he was surprised to see Walter and Danny deep in conversation at Walter's corner booth. Danny was leaning forward, engaged in a way Frank rarely saw him outside of talking about engineering. Frank walked over with the coffee pot, curious and slightly concerned. Walter didn't usually talk to strangers, and Danny could be intense when he got going on technical subjects. "Everything okay here?" "Your boy knows his materials science," Walter said with the first genuine smile Frank had ever seen on his face. It transformed him, made him look like the executive he'd once been instead of the lonely old man he'd become. "We were discussing carbon content in structural steel." Danny looked up at his father with surprise. "Mr. Brennan really knows his stuff, Dad. He was explaining why the 7018 rod you always talked about has better impact resistance in cold weather." "The limestone flux," Walter said, clearly enjoying himself. "It creates a protective slag that prevents hydrogen embrittlement. Your father knows this. He just probably never had anyone explain the chemistry behind it." They talked for another 20 minutes, Walter and Danny, about steel and strength, about building things that last versus building things that look good in quarterly reports. Walter told stories Frank had never heard, about building the Fort Pitt Bridge, about developing a new alloy that could withstand the salt air at the shipyards without corroding. Danny asked questions that showed he understood not just the theory, but the practical applications, the real-world consequences of metallurgical choices. When Walter finally got up to leave, moving slower than usual, gripping the table edge for support as he stood, he stopped and put a hand on Danny's shoulder. "You remind me of the young men I used to hire straight out of school. Smart but humble, educated, but not afraid of real work. Don't lose that. The world will try to beat it out of you. Tell you that real work happens in boardrooms and on computer screens. Don't believe them. Real work happens when knowledge meets effort, when understanding meets application." After Walter left, Danny looked at his father. "Who is that guy?" "Walter Brennan. Been coming here for 2 years. Jody Brennan, like Brennan Steel, Dad. That company was huge. They built half the bridges in Pennsylvania." Frank shrugged. "He's just Walter. Likes his eggs over easy and his coffee black." But Danny pulled out his phone, typing quickly. "Dad, look at this. Walter Brennan, founder and CEO of Brennan Steel Corporation. Sold the company 10 years ago for $300 million. He's seriously rich." Frank looked at the phone screen at a younger Walter standing in front of a massive industrial complex, then out the window where the current Walter was slowly making his way down Carson Street, shoulders hunched against the October wind. Doesn't matter, Frank said finally. He's still just Walter. 3 days later, Walter didn't show up. Frank didn't think much of it at first. Even regulars missed a day now and then. Doctor's appointments, visiting family, or just sleeping in because your body finally demanded it. But when Wednesday came and went with no sign of Walter, a cold worry began to settle in Frank's stomach. It was the kind of feeling he'd had the morning Mary collapsed in the kitchen, the instinct that something fundamental had shifted in the universe. By Thursday, he was asking other customers if they'd seen the old man who always sat in the corner booth. The construction guys shook their heads, more interested in complaining about the city's new building codes. The nurses hadn't noticed. Even Mrs. Chen, who came in every morning at 7:15 for her tea and English muffin, and noticed everything, hadn't seen Walter. On Friday morning, Frank was just starting his shift, trying to focus on setting up the coffee station the way Betty liked it when two police officers came in. They had that careful walk cops developed when they were delivering news nobody wanted to hear. Joe Murphy met them at the door, and Frank could see them talking in low voices, Joe nodding and pointing toward the kitchen. Frank's first thought was that someone had finally reported the health code violations in the walk-in freezer, but then Joe was walking toward him with that careful expression people wear when they're about to deliver bad news. Frank, you knew Walter Brennan, right? The old gentleman who came in every morning. Frank's hands stopped moving. The coffee filter he'd been holding floated to the counter. Yeah, what happened? Police said he fell at his home on Tuesday night. Neighbor found him Wednesday afternoon when newspapers started piling up. He died at UPMC Presbyterian yesterday morning. The coffee pot in Frank's hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. He set it down carefully on the counter, his welder's hands surprisingly steady, despite the tremor he felt inside. Tuesday night. While Frank had been home watching the Steelers lose to Baltimore, Walter had been lying on his floor, probably cold, probably scared, definitely alone. Was he alone? Joe nodded. Apparently. Police are trying to contact next of kin. They came here because they found a receipt from the diner in his pocket, thought we might know something about his family. Frank thought about Walter's comments about his daughter in Philadelphia, his grandson with 3 degrees who couldn't change a tire. He had family, they just weren't around much. Betty had come over, dish towel in her hand. That's a shame. He seemed like a nice old man. Quiet, but nice. He was more than nice, Frank said, surprised by the emotion in his voice. He was someone who understood things that mattered. The funeral was the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning, which meant Frank had to ask Joe for time off. He expected pushback, maybe even threats about replacement being easy to find, but Joe just nodded and said, Betty can cover. You do what you need to do. Frank put on his only suit, the one he'd bought for Mary's funeral, and hadn't worn since. It still fit mostly, though he had to leave the jacket unbuttoned. The funeral home was in Shadyside, all marble and mahogany, the kind of place that whispered money in every carefully chosen detail. Thick carpet that muffled footsteps, paintings that looked original, flowers that probably cost more than Frank made in a week. There were maybe 20 people there, which seemed impossible for a man who'd built a steel empire. Frank recognized the daughter from Walter's descriptions, Patricia, a well-maintained woman in her late 50s, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She wore a black suit that probably cost more than Frank's car. Her hair, professionally styled, her face a mask of appropriate grief that didn't reach her eyes. The grandson, Eric, was exactly what Frank had pictured, soft and polished, checking his phone every 30 seconds, even during the service. His suit was expensive but slightly too tight, like he'd gained weight since buying it, and refused to admit it. Frank sat in the back row and listened to a minister who clearly never met Walter deliver a generic sermon about life and death and redemption. The words were empty, could have been about anyone, missed everything that had made Walter real. Nothing about his understanding of steel, his pride in building things that lasted, his loneliness in a world that no longer valued what he knew. Patricia said a few words about her father's business success, about how he'd built Brennan Steel from nothing, about his charitable contributions to Carnegie Mellon's engineering program. She didn't mention his shaking hands or his daily breakfast ritual or the way his face lit up when talking about metallurgy. Eric didn't speak at all, just stood when he was supposed to, sat when directed, looked at his phone when he thought no one was watching. When it was over, Frank stood to leave, feeling like he'd attended the wrong funeral, like the real Walter Brennan was still waiting to be properly remembered. But a man in an expensive suit intercepted him at the door. He had the kind of aggressive handsomeness that suggested good breeding and better lawyers. "Mr. Sullivan, Frank Sullivan." "Yeah, I'm Robert Henderson, Mr. Brennan's attorney. I need to speak with you about Mr. Brennan's estate." Frank almost laughed. The only thing more absurd than him being at this rich man's funeral was being mentioned in his will. "I think you've got the wrong guy. I just served him breakfast." "No, Mr. Sullivan, I have exactly the right person. Mr. Brennan left very specific instructions. Could you come to my office tomorrow? Say 10 o'clock. Frank thought about his shift, about Joe's patients wearing thin, about the tips he'd miss. 25, maybe $30, the difference between having gas money and walking. "I have to work." Henderson reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card and a check. "Mr. Brennan anticipated that. This should cover your lost wages for the day." Frank looked at the check. It was for $500. Not a fortune to someone like Henderson, but enough to cover Frank's utilities for a month. 10 o'clock, Henderson said. "The address is on the card. Please don't be late. There are other parties involved who won't be happy about waiting." That night, Frank sat at his kitchen table, the same one where Mary used to help Danny with his homework, and stared at the check. $500 just to attend a meeting. He'd once made that in a good week at the furnace with overtime and hazard pay. Now it represented luxury beyond imagining. He called Danny at school. "Something strange happened today." "Strange how? You okay, Dad?" "Remember that old man you met, Walter Brennan? The steel guy?" "Yeah, what about him?" "He died, and his lawyer wants to meet with me tomorrow. Gave me $500 just to show up." There was silence on the other end. Then Danny said, "Dad, be careful. Rich people don't give money away without wanting something." But Frank didn't think Walter wanted anything from him. The old man had already gotten what he'd been looking for, someone to talk to about things that mattered, someone who understood the value of real work, someone who cut his toast without being asked and without making him feel diminished. The next morning came gray and cold, the kind of Pittsburgh morning where the sky pressed down like a lead blanket. Frank arrived at Murphy's at 4:45 earlier than even Joe and stood outside in the pre-dawn darkness, looking at the place with new eyes. The cracked sidewalk, the flickering neon, the door that stuck in humid weather and had to be yanked open. If Henderson was right about something involving Walter's estate, then this ordinary morning might be his last as just another waiter. He went through his morning routine with unusual precision, as if memorizing it. The sound of the coffee brewing, the sizzle of bacon on the flat top, Betty's chatter about her grandkids. At 9:15, Frank hung up his apron and drove downtown his 10-year-old Chevy, groaning as it climbed the parking garage ramps. Henderson's office occupied an entire floor of the Coppers building, all glass and chrome, and hushed efficiency. The receptionist, a young woman who looked like she'd never eaten at a diner in her life, led him to a conference room where 3 people were already waiting, their faces carrying the particular tension of family members about to fight over money. Patricia Brennan Hayes sat at one end of the long table, her expression carved from ice. She wore a black suit that probably cost more than Frank made in 3 months, her fingers drumming impatiently on the polished wood. Beside her, Eric Brennan lounged in his chair with studied casualness, but Frank could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched every few seconds. He was scrolling through his phone, but his eyes kept flicking to the door, to Henderson, to Frank. "Now that everyone is here," Henderson began arranging documents in front of him with surgical precision. "This better be quick," Patricia said. "I have a flight at 2, and traffic to the airport is always terrible. I'll be as efficient as possible." Henderson replied, his tone suggesting he'd dealt with impatient heirs before. Mr. Brennan was very specific about which portions of his will should be read to which parties. Frank found himself gripping the edge of the table as Henderson began reading through the legal preamble, the whereas and heretofore that wrapped simple ideas in complex language. His mind kept returning to Walter's shaking hands, the quiet dignity with which he'd faced his daily struggles. "To my daughter Patricia Brennan Hayes and my grandson Eric Brennan," Henderson read his voice carrying no emotion. I leave the sum of $3 million each to be paid from the family trust, established in 1995. Eric's head snapped up from his phone like he'd been slapped. 3 million. That's it. His voice cracked slightly, revealing his age despite his expensive suit. He sold Brennan Steel for 300 million. Where's the rest of it? Your grandfather made numerous charitable donations over the past decade, Henderson said calmly, not looking up from his documents. He was particularly generous with technical education programs and trade schools. Trade schools? Patricia's composure cracked, her voice rising. He gave our inheritance to trade schools. He gave his money to causes he believed in, Henderson corrected. Now, if I may continue? Frank watched the family drama unfold with a mixture of embarrassment and fascination. $3 million each, and they were acting like they'd been cheated. He thought about his own checking account currently holding $87 until Friday's pay. To Frank Sullivan, Henderson continued, and Frank's attention snapped back. Who showed me that dignity and skill still exist in a world that has forgotten both who served me breakfast with respect rather than pity, who recognized a man rather than a wallet, I leave the following. The room seemed to tilt. Frank heard his name but couldn't quite connect it to himself, like hearing someone call for you in a dream. First, the sum of $1.2 million to be transferred immediately to his account so that he might pay off the debts that honor incurred and have the freedom that dignity deserves. Eric shot to his feet, his chair rolling backward. This is insane. He left over $1 million to a waiter. A nobody. Sit down, Mr. Brennan, Henderson said sharply. I'm not finished. Frank couldn't breathe. 1.2 million. That was 50 years of work at his current salary. It was Danny's education paid for Mary's medical debt, erased a chance to sleep without calculating interest rates in his head. Second, Henderson continued, his voice cutting through Eric's sputtering protests. The property located at 218 Carson Street, known as Murphy's Diner, which I purchased through a holding company 18 months ago, along with all equipment licenses and associated assets. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. The diner. Walter had bought the diner. Every morning for 18 months, Frank had been serving the man breakfast in his own restaurant. Furthermore, Henderson read on, seemingly oblivious to the chaos he was creating. I established an operating fund of $800,000 to be used for renovations, equipment upgrades, and operating capital at Mr. Sullivan's discretion. This is bullshit. Eric's face had turned an alarming shade of red. My grandfather wasn't in his right mind. No sane person gives $2 million to a stranger. Patricia had gone pale, her carefully maintained composure crumbling. Daddy bought a diner. Why would he buy a diner? Henderson set down the will and pulled out a laptop. Your father anticipated these objections. He asked me to play this video in the event of any challenges to his mental capacity. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly Walter was there, sitting in what appeared to be this same conference room, but looking healthier than he had in his final months. His hands were steadier, his color better. The timestamp showed 14 months ago. If you're watching this, Walter said, his voice stronger than Frank remembered, then I'm dead, and you're probably wondering why I left so much to Frank Sullivan. Frank leaned forward, desperate to understand. The answer is simple, Walter continued. Frank represents everything I spent my life building and everything my family has forgotten. He understands that work has dignity, that skill has value, that treating people with respect costs nothing but means everything. Walter paused, his eyes seeming to look directly at his daughter. Patricia, you're my daughter and I love you, but you married for status and raised your son to value appearances over substance. You haven't visited me in 2 years except to ask for money for Eric's ventures. Patricia flinched as if struck. Eric, Walter continued, and the young man stopped pacing to stare at the screen. You have 3 degrees and no skills. You've never created anything, only consumed what others built. I've paid off your debts twice, funded 3 failed startups, and watched you burn through money like it was paper. You've never once asked me about the business I built, only about the money it generated. That's not true, Eric shouted at the screen, but Walter couldn't hear him. Frank Sullivan worked at Kerry Furnace for 20 years, creating the skeleton that holds this city up. When that life ended, when the world told him his skills were obsolete, he didn't quit. He took a job that others would consider beneath him and did it with pride. Every morning he noticed that my hands shook. Without being asked, without making a fuss, he helped me maintain my dignity by cutting my food. That simple act of kindness, repeated daily without expectation of reward, showed me more about his character than any resume could. Walter leaned forward, his eyes intense. I bought the diner to ensure Frank would have security. I watched him for 18 months, saw how he treated every customer with respect, how he worked doubles to pay for his son's education, how he never complained despite struggles that would break most men. He is what I was before money made me forget what mattered. The video paused and Walter seemed to gather himself. I know you'll be angry. I know you'll feel cheated. But I earned every penny through decades of 16-hour days. I can leave it to whoever I damn well please, and I please to leave it to someone who understands its true value. Frank Sullivan will do more good with this money than either of you ever would. The screen went dark. The conference room was silent except for the hum of air conditioning and Eric's heavy breathing. There's more, Henderson said, pulling out an envelope and a key. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Brennan left you this letter and asked that you visit this address. He handed over a brass key attached to a leather fob with an address on the north side. This won't stand, Eric said, but his voice had lost its edge, replaced by something like desperation. I'll contest it. I'll tie this up in court for years. You're welcome to try, Henderson said coolly. However, you should know that your grandfather also documented every debt he paid on your behalf, every failed venture he funded, every time you asked for money. He was prepared for this challenge. Moreover, the cognitive testing was performed by 3 independent physicians, all of whom testified to his complete mental competence. Patricia stood slowly, gathering her purse with shaking hands. He planned all of this. The whole time he was planning this. For approximately 2 years, yes. Henderson confirmed. She turned to Frank and for the first time really looked at him. Not through him like he was furniture, but at him. You knew him, she said, not quite a question. We talked every morning, Frank said, finding his voice. About steel, about work, about life. He was proud of what he built. He just wished. Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. He wished his family understood why he built it, not just what it was worth. Patricia's face crumpled slightly before she caught herself. I should go. Mom, wait. Eric started, but she was already walking to the door. Mr. Sullivan, she said, pausing at the threshold, my father was not an easy man to know. If he saw something in you worth this kind of trust, then perhaps I'm the one who missed something. After she left, Eric turned on Frank, his face ugly with rage. This isn't over. You think you've won something? You're nobody. A grease jockey who got lucky with a senile old man. I'll destroy you. Mr. Brennan, Henderson interrupted. I'd advise against making threats. Everything said in this room is being recorded. Eric stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Frank sat in the sudden quiet, staring at the key in his hand. What's this address? He asked Henderson. I don't know. Mr. Brennan only said you'd understand when you saw it. The financial transfers will be complete by end of business today. This card, Henderson handed him a business card, is your financial advisor. He'll help you manage the assets. The diner property is yours as of now. Frank stood on unsteady legs. I should tell Joe Murphy. Actually, Henderson said, pulling out another folder. Mr. Murphy has known for 18 months that he was managing the property, not owning it. He's been receiving a generous salary and will continue to do so if you choose to retain him. Mr. Brennan didn't want to disrupt the business or make you uncomfortable. The layers of Walter's planning stunned Frank. Every detail thought through, every reaction anticipated. The old man had been playing a long game, while everyone else thought he was just eating breakfast. Frank drove to the North Side address in a daze, his mind trying to process the morning's revelations. The building was old industrial brick, the kind Pittsburgh was full of remnants of when the city made things instead of just financial services and healthcare. The key opened a side door that led to a freight elevator that groaned but worked. The 3rd floor opened into a space that made Frank's knees weak. It was a fully equipped welding workshop, but not just any workshop. This was what he'd dreamed of in his best moments at Cary Furnace. Lincoln Electric TIG welders, the kind that cost more than cars. Miller MIG setups with digital displays. a plasma cutter that could slice through 4 inches of steel like butter. The walls were lined with every classification of welding rod organized and labeled with an almost obsessive precision. But it was the work area that broke him. A 50-foot beam was set up for practice runs with proper ventilation that would make any safety inspector weep with joy. There were auto-darkening helmets, the kind that adjusted instantly to protect your eyes. Leather aprons that had never been used. A grinding station with every wheel grade imaginable. On the workbench, placed precisely in the center, was Walter's letter. Frank's hands shook as he opened it. "Dear Frank," it began in Walter's unsteady handwriting. "If you're reading this, then everything went according to plan, and you're standing in my workshop. Yes, mine. I built this after I sold the company when I realized I missed working with my hands. I came here twice a week for 5 years, teaching myself to weld, to understand what my employees had done all those years. I was terrible at it at first, burned through more metal than I joined, but gradually with practice and humility I learned. There's a beauty in laying down a perfect bead and joining two pieces of metal so they become stronger together than they were apart. It's a metaphor for life, really. This workshop is my real gift to you. The money will free you from worry, the diner will give you stability, but this is where you can create. More importantly, this is where you can teach. Your son Danny has the mind of an engineer, but the hands of a craftsman. Don't let him lose that. The world needs people who understand both theory and practice. In the bottom drawer of the desk, there's something for Danny. Tell him it's for when he graduates." I spent my life building a company, Frank, but I forgot to build relationships. I forgot that the point of success is not to have it, but to share it. You reminded me of that every morning with a simple act of kindness that expected nothing in return. Make something wonderful here. Not for money, but for the joy of creation. Your friend Walter, P.S. Check the refrigerator in the corner. Frank found the desk an old steel monster that probably weighed 500 pounds. In the bottom drawer was a rosewood box containing a set of Starrett precision measuring tools, micrometers and calipers that cost thousands of dollars. The note on top read, "For Danny Sullivan, who understands that engineering starts with understanding how things are actually made." The refrigerator, an old industrial unit, hummed in the corner. Inside were 2 6-packs of Iron City beer and a note, "For after your first successful weld in the shop, don't drink alone." Frank sat on the concrete floor and cried. Not the gentle tears of sadness, but the body-shaking sobs of someone whose life had just cracked open, like an egg revealing possibilities he'd never dared imagine. He cried for Walter alone at the end, despite his millions. He cried for Mary, who died thinking she'd ruined them with her medical bills. He cried for Danny, who could now graduate without debt. But mostly he cried from the overwhelming weight of being seen, truly seen, and found worthy. His phone rang. Danny. "Dad, how did the meeting go?" Frank looked around the workshop at the thousands of dollars of equipment at the beam, waiting for someone to practice on, at the organized rows of welding rods like soldiers waiting for orders. "Danny," he said, his voice thick, "you need to come home this weekend. There's something I need to show you." "Is everything okay?" Frank stood up, walked to the window that looked out over the Allegheny River. In the distance, he could see the bridges his wells had helped maintain the skeleton of the city he'd helped build. "Everything's changed, son. Everything." That afternoon, Frank went back to the diner. The lunch rush was in full swing, Betty looking harried as she juggled 5 tables. Frank grabbed an apron and jumped in, not saying anything about the morning. Joe Murphy watched him from the register, his expression unreadable. After the rush, Joe pulled him aside. Henderson called, "Congratulations, Frank. Or should I say boss?" "You knew this whole time you knew." Joe nodded. "Walter made me promise. Said he wanted to watch you without you knowing. He paid me well to keep quiet and manage the place. I'm sorry for the deception." Frank thought about being angry but couldn't summon it. "Will you stay on as manager? I don't know the first thing about running a restaurant. If you'll have me. But Frank, you need to know something. Eric Brennan was here an hour ago asking questions about you, about your son. He's not going to let this go easy." That evening, Frank called Danny again and told him everything. The silence on the other end lasted so long, Frank thought the call had dropped. "Dad, that's $2 million. "I know. We can pay off everything. I can graduate without loans. You can quit working doubles." I know. Why did he do it? Frank thought about Walter's shaking hands about dignity, preserved in small acts about the difference between inheriting money and earning respect. Because he wanted his money to go to someone who understood what it was worth, Frank said finally. And because I cut his toast without making him ask. Danny laughed, but it sounded like he might be crying too. I'll drive down Friday night, Dad. Yeah, I'm proud of you. Mom would be too. After the call, Frank sat in his small apartment, looking at the same walls he'd stared at for 5 years. But everything felt different. Tomorrow he'd go back to Murphy's serve breakfast to the morning crowd, pour coffee for people heading to jobs that defined them. But now he'd do it as an owner, not just an employee. He thought about Eric's threat about the battles surely coming. The rich didn't give up easily, especially when they felt cheated. But Frank had faced worse. He'd held Mary's hand as she died, raised Danny alone survived the death of American manufacturing. A soft, rich kid with 3 degrees and no calluses didn't scare him. Outside Pittsburgh sprawled in the darkness, a city built on steel and sweat, trying to figure out what it wanted to be in a new century. Frank understood that struggle. He'd been one thing, been forced to become another, and now had the chance to become something more. He pulled out Walter's letter again, reading the shaky handwriting. Make something wonderful. Frank would, not just in the workshop, but in the diner, in his life, in the legacy he'd leave Danny. He'd honor Walter's gift by using it the way the old man intended, not just to enrich himself, but to lift others. Tomorrow he'd start planning. Renovations for the diner, keeping its character, but improving its bones. Better equipment for the kitchen, proper benefits for the staff, maybe even profit sharing. He'd turn it into what Walter had always seen it as, not just a place to eat, but a place where dignity was served with every meal. But tonight he just sat with the weight of transformation, feeling the shape of his new life settling around him like armor he'd have to grow into. In the morning, the brass bell would ring at 5:15, and Frank would start his shift. But everything would be different now. Everything. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and revelations. Frank met with the financial advisor Henderson had recommended, a patient man named David Chen, who walked him through investments, tax implications, and trust funds with the same methodical precision Frank had once used for reading welding blueprints. The money was real. The diner was his. The workshop waited like a promise he hadn't yet claimed. But Eric Brennan wasn't done. The first salvo came through a process server who showed up at Murphy's during the morning rush, handing Frank legal documents in front of a full restaurant. Betty nearly dropped her tray. Joe Murphy came out from behind the register, ready to intervene, but Frank just took the papers and kept working. He'd been served worse than lawsuits in his life. Contesting the will, David Chen explained later that afternoon. Claims of undue influence, mental incapacity, the usual challenges. Henderson warned me this might happen. Can he win? Not likely. Walter documented everything meticulously, but he can make it expensive and drawn out. He's hoping you'll settle to make it go away. Frank thought about Walter's shaking hands, his quiet dignity, the way he'd smiled when talking to Danny about steel. I'm not settling. The second attack was more personal. Frank started noticing a man in a gray sedan parked outside his apartment building. The same car appeared outside Danny's dormitory when Frank went to visit. Someone had been asking questions at the diner, trying to dig up dirt on Frank's past. Eric was looking for leverage. Let him look, Frank told Danny over the phone. I've got nothing to hide. 20 years of honest work raising you right, taking care of your mother. If that's not good enough, then nothing is. But Danny was worried. Dad, rich people don't fight fair. Maybe you should talk to Henderson about protection or something. Frank was about to dismiss the concern when Betty came to him with news that changed everything. Frank, there's something you need to know. That Eric kid was here yesterday when you were at the bank. He was talking to Marcus in the kitchen, offering him money for information about you. But that's not the worst part. Betty pulled out her phone, showing Frank a video she'd recorded. Eric was clearly visible, leaning against the counter, talking to someone off camera. My grandfather was senile, Eric was saying. We're going to prove he was manipulated by this con artist Sullivan. And when we do, everyone who helped him is going down too. This whole place will be shut down. You'll all be out of work. Unless you help me now. Frank's jaw tightened. Threatening him was one thing. Threatening his co-workers, people who live paycheck to paycheck like he had, that was another. He called Henderson. Eric's escalating. He's threatening my staff. Document everything. If he contacts you directly, record it if Pennsylvania law allows. Don't engage with him alone. And Frank Walter anticipated this too. Check your mail tomorrow. The next morning, a courier delivered a package to the diner. Inside was a flash drive and a note in Walter's handwriting, "For when my grandson shows his true nature." Frank plugged the drive into Joe's ancient office computer. It contained dozens of files, emails from Eric begging for money records of gambling debts, documentation of failed businesses, and most damning, a video from 2 years ago. In it, Eric was in Walter's home shouting at the old man, "You're going to die soon anyway. Why not just give me my inheritance now? What's the point of holding on to it? You can't take it with you." Walter's voice calm but tired. "The point, Eric, is that it's mine to give, not yours to take. You've never earned anything in your life. I'm your grandson. I deserve that money. You deserve what you earn, nothing more." The video ended with Eric storming out, but not before saying, "When you're gone, I'll get it all anyway. Patricia won't fight me for it." Frank saved the file and called Henderson. This changes things, doesn't it? It certainly doesn't help his case. Mental capacity challenges require showing the person was manipulated or incompetent. This video shows Walter standing up to pressure from his own family. That afternoon, Frank was in the workshop, finally allowing himself to use the equipment. He was running practice beads on scrap metal, feeling the familiar rhythm return to his hands when his phone rang. It was Patricia. "Mr. Sullivan, Frank. This is Patricia Hayes. I wonder if we could meet." They met at a coffee shop downtown, not the $6 latte kind, but a regular place where construction workers grabbed their morning caffeine. Patricia looked out of place in her designer clothes, but she didn't complain. "I owe you an apology." She started stirring sugar into her coffee with careful precision. "I've been thinking about what my father said in that video, about valuing appearances over substance. He was right." Frank waited, letting her find her words. "I didn't know he was going to the diner every morning. We hadn't really talked in 2 years. I was angry that he sold the company, thought he should have kept it in the family. But Eric would have destroyed it within a year." "Why are you telling me this?" Patricia pulled out an envelope. "Because Eric is my son, but he's also become someone I don't recognize. He called me yesterday ranting about you making threats. He mentioned something about taking care of the problem permanently. I think he might do something stupid." Frank's blood chilled. "You think he'd actually try to hurt someone?" "I don't know, but I wanted to warn you. And to give you this." She pushed the envelope across the table. "It's a letter withdrawing any support for Eric's challenge to the will. I won't help him fight you." "This must be hard for you." Patricia's composure cracked slightly. "My father was right. Eric has never built anything, never created anything. He just consumes. Maybe losing this inheritance will finally force him to grow up." She stood to leave, then paused. "Take care of the diner, Mr. Sullivan. My mother used to take me there when I was little, before father had money. It was one of the few places where he seemed happy." After she left, Frank called Danny. "Come home this weekend. Bring your stuff from the dorm." "Dad, what's wrong?" "Maybe nothing, but I'd feel better if you were here for a few days." That Friday night, Danny arrived with a carload of engineering textbooks and dirty laundry. Frank showed him the workshop, watched his son's eyes go wide at the equipment. "This is incredible." Danny breathed, running his hands over a TIG welder like it was a holy relic. "This stuff is better than what they have at school. It's ours now, yours to use whenever you want." They spent Saturday in the workshop, Frank teaching Danny the finer points of welding, things you couldn't learn from books. How to read the color of the metal, how to adjust for wind and cold, how to know by sound when the penetration was perfect. It was the kind of knowledge passed from father to son for generations, the inheritance that mattered more than money. Sunday morning, they went to the diner together. Frank was teaching Danny how to work the register when chaos erupted. It happened fast. Eric burst through the door at 7:30, wild-eyed and smelling of alcohol. He had something in his hand that Frank first thought was a gun, but realized was a tire iron. "You took everything," Eric screamed, waving the iron bar. "My inheritance, my future, everything." The diner was half full. Betty dropped behind the counter. Two construction workers stood up ready to intervene, but Frank held up a hand. Eric, put that down. Let's talk about this. Talk? You conned my grandfather. You're nobody, a worthless welder who couldn't even keep his job. Eric swung the tire iron, smashing it into the register, sending the drawer flying open, coins scattering across the floor. Danny started forward, but Frank grabbed his arm, holding him back. Your grandfather made his choice, Frank said, keeping his voice calm. He documented everything. You know you can't win this. I don't have to win in court, Eric snarled, raising the tire iron again. I just have to make you disappear. He lunged at Frank, the tire iron whistling through the air. But 20 years of industrial work had given Frank reflexes and strength that Eric's gym membership couldn't match. Frank sidestepped, grabbed Eric's wrist, and applied a joint lock he'd learned from an ex-Marine at Carey Furnace. The tire iron clattered to the floor. Stop, Frank said quietly. You're better than this. No, I'm not. Eric was crying now, all his rage collapsing into desperation. I'm nothing. 3 degrees and I'm nothing. My grandfather was right. I've never built anything, never made anything. I'm a failure. Frank could have held him for the police, could have pressed charges, ended any chance of Eric challenging the will. Instead, he did something that would have made Walter proud. He let go. You're 29 years old, Frank said. You've got 50 years to build something. Your grandfather didn't make his fortune until he was 40. You're not a failure. You just haven't started yet. Eric collapsed into a booth sobbing. Betty called the police anyway, but Frank refused to press charges. He needs help, not jail. Patricia arrived before the police, having somehow heard about the incident. She looked at her son drunk and crying in a diner booth, then at Frank. Thank you, she said simply, for not destroying him when you could have. The police took Eric for psychiatric evaluation. Patricia promised to get him into rehab therapy, whatever he needed. As they left, she turned back to Frank. My father saw something in you I didn't understand. Now I do. You could have crushed Eric legally and physically. Instead, you showed him mercy. That's strength. The next morning, Monday, the diner was busier than usual. Word had spread about the confrontation, and people came to gawk, but stayed for the food. Frank worked his shift like nothing had happened, pouring coffee, taking orders, maintaining the dignity of routine. At 11, just as the breakfast rush was ending, the door chimed and a group of men walked in. Hard men wearing work clothes and steel-toed boots, faces weathered by years of outdoor labor. Frank recognized some of them from Carey Furnace. Frank Sullivan, the lead man said. He was huge, 6'4", at least arms like bridge cables. Yeah, Tom Morrison. I worked blast furnace number 2 when you were doing repairs. Heard you had some trouble yesterday. It's handled. Tom looked around the diner, then back at Frank. We also heard you own this place now, and that you're planning to fix it up, maybe hire some people. Maybe. Well, bunch of us from the old days were between jobs. If you need work done, construction, electrical, whatever, we're available. And Frank, he lowered his voice, anyone gives you more trouble, you call us. We look after our own. They left after ordering coffee to go, but the message was clear. Frank wasn't alone. The Brotherhood of Steel Workers, the men who'd built Pittsburgh with their hands, they remembered him. 3 weeks later, Eric's challenge to the will was formally withdrawn. Henderson called with the news. Patricia convinced him. She also got him into a program. Rehab first, then vocational training. He wants to learn a trade. Good for him, Frank said, and meant it. Over the next month, Frank transformed. He kept working morning shifts, but in the afternoons, he learned the business. Joe Murphy proved an excellent teacher, showing him food costs, labor percentages, vendor negotiations. The diner started making improvements small, at first a new coffee machine, better lighting, fixed air conditioning, then larger ones. Frank hired 2 of his old co-workers from the furnace men who needed second chances like he'd gotten. He raised everyone's wages, instituted profit sharing, created a small emergency fund for staff who hit hard times. The diner became what Walter had envisioned, not just a place to eat, but a community. Danny graduated in May. Frank sat in the audience at Penn State wearing a new suit that actually fit, watching his son receive his mechanical engineering degree. Danny had already accepted a job at a Pittsburgh firm specializing in infrastructure, building bridges, like his father had helped maintain. After the ceremony, Danny introduced Frank to his professors, telling them about the workshop about the equipment. One professor, intrigued, asked if Frank would consider hosting internships, teaching practical welding to engineering students. They know the theory, the professor said, but they don't know how things actually get built. Frank thought about Walter's letter about making something wonderful. Yeah, I could do that. That evening, Frank and Danny went to the workshop. They opened beers from Walter's refrigerator, now kept stocked, and sat looking at the equipment that had changed their lives. I've been thinking, Danny said, we could do more with this place. Not just teaching welding, but real skills training. For kids aging out of foster care, veterans, people who need second chances. Frank smiled. It was exactly what he'd been thinking too. Walter would like that. We could call it the Brennan Institute for Technical Arts. No, Frank said. Walter didn't want his name on things. We call it the Carson Street Workshop. Keep it simple. Keep it about the work. They clinked bottles, father and son, planning a future neither could have imagined a year ago. 6 months later, the workshop was training its first cohort of students, 12 men and women learning skills that couldn't be outsourced or automated. Frank taught welding, Danny assisted with technical drawing and computer-aided design, and Tom Morrison from the furnace taught structural steel. The door opened one morning and Eric Brennan walked in. He was different now, thinner but healthier, his expensive clothes replaced with work boots and jeans. Mr. Sullivan, he said, his voice uncertain. Frank, Eric. I know I don't have any right to ask, but I was wondering if maybe you'd consider taking me on as a student. I want to learn how to build something real. Frank looked at this young man who'd tried to attack him, who'd threatened everything he'd built, and saw something Walter might have recognized, a soul looking for purpose. You'll start at the bottom, Frank said. Grinding, cleaning, prep work. The actual welding comes after you prove you can handle the basics. I understand. Show up every day, work hard, respect the tools and the people. That's all I ask. Eric proved surprisingly dedicated. His soft hands blistered, then calloused. He learned to read blueprints, to understand metal, to take pride in a clean weld. Patricia came by once to watch her son work, tears in her eyes as she saw him create something real for the first time. He comes home exhausted but happy, she told Frank. He's never been happy before? Not really. One afternoon, Frank was teaching Eric how to run a vertical weld when Henderson called with unexpected news. There's going to be a dedication ceremony, Henderson said. The city wants to recognize the Carson Street Workshop for its workforce development programs. The mayor will be there. I don't need recognition, Frank said. It's not about you. It's about the program. The publicity will help you get more funding, help more people. The ceremony was held at the workshop on a Thursday afternoon. The mayor spoke about the importance of skilled trades, about second chances, about the dignity of honest work. Frank stood in the back, uncomfortable with the attention. Then Patricia stepped to the microphone. My father, Walter Brennan, believed that real wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in what you built and who you helped to build it. Frank Sullivan embodies that belief. He took my son, who was lost, and helped him find purpose. He took men and women society had written off and gave them skills that will last a lifetime. This is my father's true legacy. After the ceremony, Frank found himself alone in the workshop with Eric, who was practicing his beads on a piece of scrap steel. You're getting better, Frank said, watching the steady arc. I had a good teacher. Eric shut off the welder, lifted his mask. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you give me a second chance? After everything I did, Frank thought about Walter's shaking hands, about dignity preserved in small acts, about the difference between justice and mercy. Because your grandfather gave me one first, Frank said, and because everyone deserves a chance to build something better. Murphy's Diner thrived under Frank's ownership. He never changed the name, never modernized beyond necessity. It remained what it had always been, a place where working people could get good food at fair prices, where dignity was served with every meal. The corner booth, Walter's booth, bore a small brass plaque, reserved for those who need to be seen. Every morning, Frank still worked the breakfast shift. He'd pour coffee for construction workers, take orders from nurses, chat with regulars who'd become friends. And sometimes when an elderly person came in alone, moving carefully, struggling with the simple tasks that age makes difficult, Frank would guide them to Walter's booth, cut their food without being asked, and remember the man who changed his life with a gift disguised as an inheritance. One morning exactly 2 years after Walter's death, Frank was refilling coffee when Danny walked in with news. "Dad, remember that bridge rehabilitation project I've been working on? The Birmingham Bridge." "Yeah, they need specialized welding for the structural repairs. My firm wants to subcontract it to the Carson Street workshop. They want you to lead the crew." Frank set down the coffee pot, his hand steady. "Building bridges again. Rebuilding them, actually. Making them stronger. It's a 6-month contract, good money. You could train Eric and the others on real infrastructure work." Frank looked around the diner at Betty taking orders, at Joe working the register at the booth where Walter used to sit. Then he looked at his son, the engineer, who still understood that things had to be built before they could be designed. "Tell them yes," Frank said. That afternoon, Frank stood on the deck of the Birmingham Bridge, 200 feet above the Monongahela River, teaching Eric and 3 other students how to weld in the wind. The city sprawled beneath them, a testament to generations of builders, each one adding their strength to the whole. As Frank watched Eric lay down a perfect beat on a critical joint, he heard Walter's voice in the wind. "Real work happens when knowledge meets effort, when understanding meets application." The workshop continued to grow. Within a year, they were training 50 students with a waiting list. Danny designed a curriculum that combined theoretical knowledge with practical skills. Tom Morrison brought in other veterans from the steel industry, men with decades of experience, who thought their knowledge was obsolete until they found students eager to learn. Patricia became an unexpected advocate, using her connections to secure funding and contracts. "This is what my father would have wanted," she said at a fundraising dinner. "Not monuments or buildings with his name, but people with skills, dignity, and purpose." Eric completed his training and got hired by a construction firm specializing in historic preservation. His first project was restoring the ironwork on a Carnegie library. He sent Frank a photo of himself on scaffolding welding mask, up grinning beside a perfectly restored railing. "Made something that will last," the text read. "Thank you." 3 years after Walter's death, Frank received an unexpected visitor at the diner. A young woman, maybe 30, professionally dressed but with calloused hands. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Sarah Chen. I was one of the engineers on the Birmingham Bridge project. I remember you. You asked good questions about heat-affected zones." She smiled. "I wanted to thank you. Watching you work, learning from you, it changed how I think about engineering. I realized I'd been designing things without understanding how they actually get built. I've started taking welding classes at your workshop. Danny's a good teacher. He learned from the best." She paused. "I also wanted to tell you something. My grandfather worked at Brennan Steel. He was a foreman in the rolling mill. He used to say Walter Brennan was the only owner who understood that steel was made by men, not machines. I think he would have been proud to know what you've done with his legacy." After she left, Frank sat in Walter's booth, looking out at Carson Street. The neighborhood was changing, young families moving and new businesses opening. The diner had become an anchor, a reminder that not everything needed to be upgraded or reimagined. Some things just needed to be preserved and passed on. Danny joined him, sliding into the opposite side of the booth. "Busy morning?" Danny asked. "The usual. You teaching a class at 10, basic metallurgy. We've got 3 kids from the Foster system starting today." Frank smiled. "Your mother would be proud. She would have loved this, all of it." Danny paused. "I've been thinking about something. What if we expand not just welding, but all the trades? Plumbing, electrical, carpentry. Create a real technical institute. That's a big dream. You taught me that big dreams are worth having. We've got the space in the building next door. The owner wants to sell." Frank thought about Walter, about building things that last, about legacy measured not in dollars but in lives changed. "Let's look at the numbers," Frank said. 5 years after Walter's death, the Carson Street Technical Institute occupied 3 buildings and trained 200 students annually. Frank still worked the morning shift at the diner 3 days a week, still cut toast for those who needed it, still remembered the lesson Walter had taught him, that dignity existed in small acts of kindness, repeated without expectation of reward. Eric had started his own restoration company, specializing in historic ironwork. He employed 6 graduates from the workshop, paying them union wages, treating them with the respect Walter had believed every worker deserved. Patricia had become board chair of the institute using her business acumen to secure sustainable funding. "My father built a steel empire," she said at the 5th anniversary celebration, "but this is his greatest achievement, even if his name isn't on the building." Tom Morrison had developed a program for veterans teaching them to translate military skills to civilian trades. "Frank gave me purpose when I thought I was done," he told the graduation class. "Now I get to pass that on." The diner remained unchanged, a constant in a transforming neighborhood. The corner booth was never empty. If it wasn't occupied by someone who needed to be seen, Frank would sit there himself reading applications from prospective students planning curriculum with Danny, or just watching the street life flow past. One winter morning, the bell rang at 6:45, and an elderly man shuffled in. He wasn't Walter, would never be Walter, but he was alone and moved carefully, gripping a cane with arthritic hands. Frank guided him to the corner booth. "Coffee, please, black." When Frank brought his breakfast, everything was cut into manageable pieces. The man looked at the plate, then up at Frank, and something passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, dignity preserved. "Thank you," the man said quietly. "No problem. Take your time." As Frank walked away, he glanced at the brass plaque on the booth. Below the original inscription, Danny had added a new line, "In memory of Walter Brennan, who saw everyone." The bell rang again. More customers. Frank picked up the coffee pot and went to work, owner of a diner, founder of an institute, rebuilder of bridges. But at heart, still the same man who'd noticed an old man shaking hands and acted without being asked. The workshop hummed with activity. Students learned to weld, to build, to create things that would outlast them. The Birmingham Bridge carried thousands of commuters daily, its joints strengthened by Frank's work and his students' growing skills. The city's infrastructure, once crumbling, was being rebuilt by hands that understood the value of honest work. Frank thought about Walter often, especially in the early morning when the diner was quiet and the coffee was just starting to brew. He'd imagined the old man walking through the door, shuffling to his booth, ordering his usual. He'd imagined telling him about the workshop, the institute, the lives changed. "You did this," Frank would say in his imagination. "All of it." And Walter would smile, that rare smile that transformed his face, and say, "No, Frank, you did. I just gave you the tools." One evening, Frank and Danny stood on the roof of the institute, looking out over Pittsburgh as the sun set behind the bridges. The city's bones were visible in the fading light, the steel skeleton that held everything up, built by generations of workers whose names were forgotten but whose work endured. "Think we've made something wonderful?" Danny asked. Frank thought about Eric, transformed from entitled grandson to skilled craftsman. About Tom Morrison finding purpose in teaching after thinking his useful days were done. About the hundreds of students who'd passed through the workshop, each one carrying forward the knowledge of how to build, how to create, how to work with dignity. "Yeah," Frank said, "I think we have." As darkness settled over, the city lights began to flicker on in homes and businesses, each one a small beacon in the gathering dark. The institute's windows glowed with warm light, night classes in session, the sound of hammers and saws and welding arcs, creating a symphony of creation. The brass bell at Murphy's Diner would ring again at 5:15 tomorrow morning. Frank would be there, ready to serve coffee, take orders, and watch for those who needed to be seen. The workshop would open at 7, students arriving eager to learn. Danny would teach, Eric would build, Tom would guide, Patricia would advocate, and somewhere in whatever came after this life, Walter Brennan would know that his true fortune had been invested wisely, generating dividends not in dollars, but in dignity, not in profits, but in purpose, not in monuments, but in the simple, profound act of one person seeing another clearly and helping without being asked. The work would continue. Steel would be joined. Bridges would be strengthened. Food would be served with respect. Skills would be passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, the true inheritance that no market crash could destroy, no lawsuit could challenge, no time could diminish. Frank smiled, looking out at his city, his home, the place where he'd learned that real worth came not from what you had, but from what you built, not from what you kept, but from what you gave away, not from being seen, but from seeing others. The bell would ring tomorrow at 5:15. Frank would be ready. The work would continue. The legacy would endure.